Hi, I'm Justin Roy, and I'm here with Perry Christenberry today. We're here with Sigma Swimming, and we're going to have a conversation about the world of swimming.
So this conversation came out of Justin and I have been doing videos for a while. If you haven't seen them, you should see them. His are brilliant. He really moves towards competition swimming. That's his focus. My focus is much more on beginning and particularly working with scared adults. So we're going to talk a little about different about that today. And one of the things he said in his video was that kicking was the engine of the stroke, which I completely disagree with. And so we were standing around on the deck talking about kicking and how you perceive those and how those things are different. And some brilliant person, no idea who it was, said, hey, that'd be a great topic for a conversation. So here we are to talk about it. So we'll start talking about kicking, if that's good for you, and then we'll build and go from there.
Great.
So the conversation was kicking is the engine of the stroke. That's what keeps it moving and going.
When you think about a Ferrari and you think about an F-150, what do you think is going to win in a race? That's not to say that the F-150 isn't powerful, and that's nothing against trucks, but the one difference between the two is the engine is in the back. Speedboat versus a paddle wheel, engine is in the back. If we want to be fast, if we want to be efficient, we should look to emulate those things when we're in the water.
My statement was that for freestyle and backstroke particularly, kick, even for world-class kickers, is only about 30% of their stroke. Most people nowhere even near that, and for a lot of my adults, it's a really hard thing for them to learn, and it creates a great deal of frustration, and it's unnecessary because the pull is such a strong component, and in many cases we don't need it. Sinkers are a little different, but in many cases we don't need it, and so that's where we started talking, and Justin's take on it's a little different.
Right, yeah, no, as a competitive swimmer my entire life, I feel, and I'm perhaps a little biased, I dealt with some shoulder injuries throughout my career, so I spent a lot of time kicking, a lot of time getting better at it. And especially in the short course world of swimming, that's 25 yards, we've seen a shift in just a vast shift towards kicking and underwater kicking in particular over the world. Great example right now was this year's NCAA's Leon Marchand just broke the NCAA record in the 400 IM. Never seen anything like it before. He kicked almost 15 meters on all 16 laps, I guess barring breaststroke for the 4, but the rest of them, he's kicking the whole way.
That's crazy.
He's swimming 10 yards per lap, right? So then we're swimming 160 instead of 400, right? Yep. Taking a little bit more of an older example, they had to limit underwater kicking at one point with guys or women like Misty Hyman and Mary T. Maher, who were phenomenal kickers setting world records, and they had to put a limit of the 15-meter mark. So I feel like to be world-class, at least from a competitive standpoint, you can't not be good at kicking. Ledecky might be an outlier, perhaps, but even then, when she was 15, 19, she was still a pretty good kicker for somebody who was swimming all the distance events. And as I use in my videos, why be an F-150 when you can be a Ferrari? The engine's in the back, right?
There you go. So this is one of the huge differences between competitive swimming and recreational or leisure swimming, fitness swimming, even to a point on that. Justin coaches masters, and we'll talk about that because he's got folks who sit in both of those buckets in that space. And for my folks, they want to come in, they want to go, I always talk about we want to go to Bubba's pool party. We just want to go there, we want to be comfortable, we want to be able to talk with our friends. If we've got folks with boats, we want to be able to sit in the water with them and not be scared about what's going on. We don't care how fast we go. Our goal isn't to run, 500 meters in, sub 5 minutes or anything just superhuman like that. It's just we want to putz along. And so it's a really different feel, and you coach it a little different, and it certainly changes the priorities along the way. So we talk sometimes about fast swim versus slow swim, competitive swim versus rec swim. in between those, and it just makes a huge difference about what the goal is for the person coming in the door. You want to talk masters for a second about that and how that fits with those?
Yeah, and I think everybody in masters swimming comes from different backgrounds. I think I've talked about it in other videos about, you have some triathletes, you have some former collegiate swimmers. I've had the benefit of coaching a few former All-Americans, and getting to spend some time talking with them, and also people who are never, they're more learned, not, it's not in their nature as much, where they've been doing it since they were children. And I think a lot of those ideas apply. A lot of them are heavy pullers, and especially as you get a higher in age, I have a few swimmers that are above the 60 mark as well, and they aren't quite as prolific of kickers, at least anymore or at all. And so it's interesting to think about from a mobility standpoint too. A lot of the master swimmers, as they get into adulthood, it's just a little bit more natural to move through with the arms than to be, our hips get tight. My hips get tight. I've had tendonitis since I was 15. So I understand that. I think an interesting point to make that, I was thinking about while you were talking is kicking is pretty hydrodynamic for the most part. I mean, if you're kicking with a board or on your back, you're in a straight line, right? You're not having to, lift your arms out of the water. And for the most part, most people are natural floaters.
Right,
most,
right. No, it's agreed. Except so many of your certainly your world-class people are not going to be floaters. They're not going to fit that category, the vast majority of those guys.
Right. So, once upon a time, I couldn't float very well, but things have changed, right?
Yeah, I share that with you. Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting to think about floating from a weighting perspective. So if you're just laying on your back, it does take a little bit more to bring the arm around. I mean, this is incrementally, of course, right? But I can tell you, and I've talked to many a master swimmer, and even some of my own club swimmers who I coach, that I can just sit there and pedal the bike all day.
Yeah.
I can just lay on my back, put my head on the pillow, that is the water, and go. So some of it is strenuous because you are having to push more of your body weight. But I mean, the analogy I've used with you in our previous conversation is would you rather walk up a flight of stairs or crawl on your hands up a flight of stairs? And what's going to be easier, And that's what I always felt. But once again, I tend to lean my bias towards kicking because I liked it, and it was something that became such a formative part of my growth in my own career.
Yep. And I know I talked with Andrew, who's the founder of Sigma, about the conversation we had. And his statement was, technically it's probably right, at least for flutter kick, which is what we were talking about in this case because it was freestyle. But he said when you start moving into that world-class athlete or the higher level athlete, the kick is really the thing that you find as a huge separator. And it really makes it's such a gigantic difference that it's the thing you focus on as a competitive coach much more than maybe even that you certainly don't even need to hit that kind of a focus for fitness, but you certainly have to have it to be serious in the competition world. And that made sense to me. It's like, okay, I get that. And then, of course, the other piece is, the Sigma comes out of a competitive space, right? Everything we started with was about competition. And it's now broadened out further, and we even have some water polo tucked away in there, and we've got all of our adults and our scared swimmer stuff that's been built out there. So it's kind of changing, but it's come out of that competitive place. But the thing that I keep reminding myself of, most of my people who come in, they want to go snorkeling, a few want to be scuba divers, they want to play in the pool with their grandkids. Those are the spaces they want to go, and there's a bigger world. So when I was young, Johnny Weissmuller was the man in competitive swimming. He became Tarzan, for those of you who are old like me who remember those movies. He always swam with his head out of the water. He won gold medals. He was never beaten in a professional race. He never put his face in the water when he swam. unheard of today, right? Absolutely unheard of. That's the way I learned to swim. That's the way everybody swam because that's the way Johnny swam. It's still the way water polo people swim, you know, unless they're going back to relax. It's like they just scored their point, they're going to coast back, they're going to get in their place. They'll put their face in the water then just as a relax and let them settle. But when they're playing, when they're in the middle of the game and they're swimming, their head's up, they're watching it. If they've got the ball, it's between their hands as they're moving along and pushing. Artistic swimmers, the old synchronized swimmers, are some of my favorite people. You know, their heads are out of the water when they're swimming and moving, and they're doing it in a very stiff kind of a formal way, which I think is absolutely fascinating because I've tried and I nearly killed myself doing that. And you know, and they spend such a huge amount of time sculling and treading, which isn't something that you need to stay alive in my leisure world, in my, you know, Bubba's pool party world kind of deal. And which doing any of that would be a travesty for a competitive swimmer, right? It's like, what are you doing? Get your head down, you know, that whole thing. So just thinking about the breadth of swim that is out there that sometimes we don't see as we come out of a competitive space and we think this is all there is, and it's really a whole lot bigger game.
Right, and I think, like in most sports, I do feel like there's very few topics in sports, in swimming also in particular, that are a 100% tried and true right answer.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of philosophies to starting, as you've talked about, with, you know, just getting in the water for the first place, the old, you know, grandpa threw me in as a toddler versus, you know, I kind of eased my way step by step and being able to do that. To your point, kicking does require you to get horizontal. And a lot of people who are scared swimmers, are newly learned swimmers, don't like being horizontal because there's an element of of control or lack thereof, you know, that's affecting them through that. So to your point, it's more, I guess where I rewind is it's always going to feel like the engine to me. If you think about old Mississippi River paddle wheel, which has got that nice paddle wheel, usually one in the front and one in the back. Or you've got a Chris Craft that you just bought off the lot, multiple engines in the back, you know, so when you think about it from machinery standpoint and getting through the water, which one of those two things is going to win the race? But from a necessity standpoint, I think that, once again, there's more conversation to be had.
Or even a comfort standpoint, which is much where I live. And it's fun, you start talking about the engine in the back and speed, and you can see his eyes light up, right? It's this spark, it's this excitement about it. And I don't have that same spark about speed, I have that same spark about comfort and being settled. So it's an interesting dichotomy as we teach, right? As we go. We talked a little, you mentioned people getting thrown in the water as they're kids and learning that kind of place. And we talked about it earlier about the trauma it does for some, and yet other people come up out of it and how that plays. But we were talking a little about swimming religions the other day. You know, things that, you know, you just can't cross that. You can't change that. You can't make that happen. And in truth, because it is a bigger sport, that's a harder thing to find as we get rolling, as we get going down the road.
Absolutely.
And you probably have a lot of trouble finding that with your masters, don't you? Just because of the variety of people who are tucked away in there?
Yeah, I think it's such a large umbrella, you know, that there's a lot of different philosophies, and a lot of it is era, you know? With swimming, the 90s, the ground and pound, yards. But if you think about that era of 70s, 80s, 90s as well, and the aesthetic involved, you go back to even lifting with the Tom Platzes and the Arnolds and the, you know, just volume and do, and that's what's going to make you better. And everything is a lot more technically put together now. There isn't as most of you probably know, 2023 is not the gritty, rough and tough 70s, out on the streets as it it once was. Right now is a little interesting of how everything is very technically put together. People have trainers from a really young age People are very well put together. So the philosophies, the religions have changed. You've got to have a trainer, you've got to have a dietitian, you've got to have a this and that. I mean, even for me, and I was, in high school 10 years ago, it was different. I think I was a little bit more raw in my day-to-day schedule, and even more so going back to the old swim religions of how you're supposed to learn. And, Dad's taking us to the lake house and pushing us off the dock and saying, get back, It's a little different, and it offers a better perspective on trauma. I think that we're a little bit more receptive to that as well nowadays.
We certainly are.
Yeah. Absolutely. So how to come about swimming and what is swimming to all of us is changed, and it's shifted. In some ways it may be different, but once again, going back to the beginning of your question, I think the umbrella that is Masters is interesting just because I have people in their 60s and their 40s and their 20s, and how they learned to swim was vastly different. And some feel that they're better for it, and others feel like, well, I would have killed to kind of ease my way in, 20 years ago when I was first learning how to swim. I think in some ways it created a little bit of an unhealthy relationship for some of them too.
With the water?
With water, absolutely.
Yeah. The, you said something, throwing in the water. You were talking about technical pieces of that. So in the old days, right, and I'm saying 50s kind of part of the world, what it meant to swim, I think that whole sense has changed. What it meant to swim back there was that you were comfortable in the water and you could get from place to place, and it wasn't about so much about technical stuff, and for some it was about competition, certainly, because we were racing and Weissmuller was out there. But for a lot of people it was just about being able to play in the water and do that kind of stuff. As we've moved, which didn't necessarily mean strokes at all, right? Didn't necessarily mean you learned any strokes, you were just able to move around. Through the 70s, 80s, 90s, it became much more a stroke-based thing and was much less about comfort. And so the thing we're doing and the thing other people like us are doing is going back to find that comfort, that space, so that it's not the technical drive. You don't look at every little movement of your hand. You don't look at every little thing. It's not about stroke. It's about being comfortable, about moving through the water, and about having that relationship with the water that you love. It's like, okay, I love the water.
Right.
If I look at me, if y'all look at my breaststroke kick, none of the coaches think it's a particularly good kick, but I get across the lake, right? I mean, I get across the water, I do what I need to do. If I go and race, which I won't do because my knees wouldn't allow that, I may get DQ'd along the way, and so I may have to do something else for that. But just for comfort, it's an easy, smooth, nice stroke for me, and it's nice to carry that forward. It's interesting, we have a lady coaching for us now who was a swimmer at A&M, conference title holder for breaststroke. She still, as of, a month ago, I think we looked, she still had the 50th fastest 200 breaststroke time in the world, which it's not even something I can grasp in my brain, to be honest with that, in the world. And she hated it, and she was so glad to be done with swimming, and it was such a terrible, terrible thing for her relationship with the water. And so she had a roommate who was coaching with us who said, you should come watch this. They're teaching people who are scared of the water how to swim, and they're teaching them to love the water. And she came and she watched, and she said, this is so cool. She said, it reminds me of why I started any of this, and I've completely lost it. And it's really cool to watch her get it back and share that with other people, with all the talent that she had, which for her is just, it's just, I'm glad to have it behind me. So fascinating as you talk about the relationship with water.
Absolutely. I mean, I think many former swimmers do tend to go through a certain phase. It depends on how rooted your relationship was, because I know some former very competitive swimmers on the NCAA level that wanted nothing to do with it. And it wasn't one of those like, I hate it now, I'm gonna love it again. They just were done. For me, I think where it differed was I always loved swimming. I mean, I said every swimmer goes through either I'm gonna go be a triathlete or I'm gonna start weightlifting every single day and become bigger than I've ever been, and so on and so forth. For me, where I think that was a little different, I mean, I went through some of that, but coming back around, I just always felt the need to give back. I mean, you know, in the terms of your coaches and the ones that you've had that have swum at a high level in the past, it's afforded them so many great opportunities, you know, and somebody took the time out of their day, you know, for me, 10, 15 years ago to teach me. And, you know, when I was just as scared as the next guy. And so being able to apply that and then just come full circle. And, you know, I want to pay forward a loving relationship with the water as opposed to the alternative. I just, whether it's access or, you know, financial reasons or just location in the country, swimming isn't as widely learned, and I that's something that I would devote my life to expanding, you know, even into my future careers as an adult. I think it's really important that people learn how to swim and become comfortable and enjoy the water. I mean, I think that's, like you said, is the most important point. And you know, on that note, I did want to bring up, you know, what do you feel about teaching learners comparatively to perhaps what your notion of competitive swimming is what do you find to be easier? You know, you made the point about technique. There does not need to be, I don't need a legal breaststroke kick to get across the pool, you know. But what do you find that it might be easier? Where do you find that some of the pitfalls come in?
So what an interesting question. So I don't know if it's ever easier teaching somebody something, but it's certainly different. So for beginners, especially those who are really scared of the water, we usually have conversations before they come in just to see what's going on. Most beginners who are scared of the water have some kind of trauma in their past history, or there's something carried through from family or from a community that they've carried with them for years. And so when they're walking into the water, or when they're even thinking about walking into the water, there's already this fear weight around them. And it makes it hard for them to see, and it makes them hard for them to learn because they're just scared when they get started. So the goal for everything that we do in our group, and you know it because you've helped us with it, is to have comfort from day one, to not do anything that you're not comfortable with, to go slow, to take your time, to settle in and to start that relationship in a pleasant way with the water, with as much distance as you need, slowly working your way in, right? So that's a very different challenge, and it's a much more emotional side of a challenge than it is for teaching somebody who already knows how to swim faster, where the technique piece is so important. So when I have Cameron or one of the other coaches there who really have good skills, working with a group of advanced people, it's like if they call and they're out for a week or they're traveling or whatever, and I have to pick up the advanced group, I can get by with the advanced group, but you wouldn't want me to be your coach if you were trying to get somewhere, because it's just not what I'm good at, because I don't see those little things. I miss them along the way. I don't notice the change in your hand. I don't notice that, you know, three steps back you missed something that made your hand come across your midline kind of deal. It's like I just see it cross the midline. I don't know why it got there. And the really good coaches are 4 or 5 steps back, seeing the things that create the things down the road, right? But I can do that from a fear point of view for folks who come in, and I can say, I see this, I see this, I see this, that's going to play out this way. If I intervene here, then we can stop this from playing, we can begin to make it move. But it's a completely different set of skills. I'm going to use some of the basic techniques, but I'm going to do, so I'm believer in successive approximation as a way to learn, right? So it's the way kids do it. They don't get it exactly right. You don't worry about making them do whatever it is you want just perfectly the very first time. They're going to get it. They're going to finally fine-tune it. So if we can get the adults with the basic understanding of, push down to go up and facing the water and getting comfortable with that, and how to keep water out of your nose, and those very, very basic skills, if we can do those well, then it lets them move forward a little at a time. But those aren't even things that get considered in the competitive swimming space. So it's really, in fact, I think it's a trick. I think when we find competitive swimmers who are capable of backing up as far back as they need to go to start with somebody who's scared in the water, I think that's an unusual person, because that stuff that is so muscle memory, it's just so much a part of their world, that to back up and to be able to see it and understand it, to me, is fascinating, because they're so much further from a technique-y kind of point down the line. It's like to be able to back up and go that slow into that small a piece. I'm just amazed that when they pull it off. I'm amazed when people are comfortable with that.
Right, I dealt with some of those same pitfalls of just, understanding how to, it was a little bit of an adjustment coaching adults, and just being able
especially from kids.
to understand it. Yep, absolutely. And so that was different, and just learning how to take a step back, and even for me in my formative years, going to a pool party with friends from high school, everybody knows how to swim, they can survive, you know what I mean? But to your point of push down to go up or push back to go forward, a lot of people don't understand that, and I think that it's so innate for swimmers. We're used to playing like seals in the deep water, and flips and bubble rings and this, that, and the other. You know where you are in space. Proprioception is such a big topic in swimming, is just being able to know where you are in space, especially because you're in another medium. We're not on land, we're in the water, you're not rooted to anything, you're just out in space. Right. But going back to adults and learners, one of the things that I think that I had, one of the pitfalls I had, was when to give a gentle nudge and when not to.
Yeah.
Because with my swimmers, they've heard me raise my voice on many occasions, not in a derogatory manner, but it's when we've been holding up a standard all year, and then things are it's not every day, but some days, we all have them. We all have our weeks, and it seems like there's a full moon out. Everybody kind of happens to be just having an off day on the same day.
Yeah.
But what do you feel about, is there a line of pushing adult learners ever, or what's your opinion on stagnation? I know there's a point where it's like, I'm okay where I'm at, I don't need to go any further.
Yeah.
But do you ever feel like, if you see from a personality standpoint, like that your learner wants to get better, but has just been plateaued for, let's say, 2, 3, 4 weeks? Do you feel like there's a line where it's like, well, let's keep trying to get to that next stage, or?
So my focus on it is that I just don't push. For mine, I don't push.
Sure.
It is. I encourage. I'll talk a lot from the first day. Most of the time, as I'm teaching some skill, I'm thinking about how this is going to help them when they're down in 12 foot, and I start talking with them about. So it doesn't matter today. We're not going today. But when you're down in 12 feet of water, this skill is going to translate this way, right? So I'm always looking ahead to say, this is the way this works. If you want to go this far, this is the way this works for that. And I stay back there. But there are some people, and particularly, and you see them in the master's piece, right? But there are some people who kind of want to be nudged. It's the way they like to.
Right.
It's the way they like to interact. They like to be challenged. They might not do that themselves, but they like it.
Sure.
And you can usually ask them, and they'll say, "Yeah, I usually want to do that. Otherwise, I'll stay here and be comfortable the whole time." And for me, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to let you stay here and be comfortable the whole time, but you can go over with Tim or Bree or whoever, right? and they'll push you along. They'll challenge you a little more directly. And the more advanced somebody is and the further they go down the line, I think the more comfortable they become with that. Well, that's not true. Some people are much more comfortable with that. Other people just want to go at their pace, really, really slow. And any push at all, any nudge at all scares them and moves them out of their point. So I think there's a person line, but I think it's individual, and you just kind of have to ask to see, right?
Sure. Yeah, with some of the masters, I actually did find that when I first took over with masters, it was during long course as well, mind you, so just a lot more swimming involved. For those of you that aren't, long-time swimmers, long course is full Olympic length, 50 meters, so a lot fewer walls, a lot fewer stoppage. Yeah. You just have to keep moving and keep plodding through the water. I'm personally not very privy to long course. I was a kicker once again, so it's a lot of kicking. If you want to accept Perry's point here, long course kicking, not as fun.
Yeah.
But I found it interesting. We did a lot of free and back, and they said, we want to do IM, and I didn't know that because it's a bunch of adults. Adults aren't as plastic. They're not as willing to listen sometimes, and not as willing to make changes because they just aren't as malleable. They have pre-existing schemas and notions of fear and things like that. But when they said, we want to do IM, want to do fly, want to do breast, want to do dolphin kick and things like that, I was just taking it easy on them. Pardon me, the 22-year-old at the time that was worried about hips and backs and
those
shoulders.
Those old guys,
right? And so I think it's also, and we can get into this later, but talking about coaching kids versus coaching adults and just how starkly different, but surprisingly similar it can be in some ways. But rewinding, it was interesting that, they do want to be nudged. I've had a swimmer that asked me to push him harder, give him harder intervals, and I felt like I was coaching to his strengths. But if he truly wants to push with masters or potentially compete again or what have you, then I think it's really interesting to toe that line.
So I think there's a big difference between again, it's kind of that competitive versus the leisure and versus the comfort piece.
Sure.
Because when you've got folks who want to do the competitive, they're almost always people who've been competitive all their life. Most of them are used to having coaches push them. There are some exceptions, but they're used to having coaches push them. They like that. That's what they expect. If you're not doing that, it's like you're not doing your job. And especially in the master space, some of those people were NCAA people, right?
Sure.
And college swimmers, and it's like, I could sit here and just swim 4,000 yards and take it easy and get by for my day, but I'd rather feel like at the end of the day I'm tired and worn out and I've done something, so give me a push for that. Triathletes are particularly like that, right? In fact, I find the trouble with triathletes is that they are pushing so hard they don't ever get the comfort piece of that, and it's like
Agreed.
You've got to slow down to make that happen. But you were talking about, and on that topic about adult learners, okay? My experience with adults is that they want to understand, especially the scared adults. They want to understand. When you work with kids, they don't care, right? They don't want to understand. If anything, they want to just do, and maybe they don't even want to do, and you're having to try to get them to do, right?
Sure.
But adults who come in as adults want to be there, and they want to understand, and the understanding's a really important part for them to be able to take the next step into whatever learning piece it is. There's some information that when you give them, it's like, oh, really? Oh, and they've got these, you talked about schemas in their heads, right? They've got these schemas about what it's like in the water and how the water behaves. And especially for the scared adults, those are usually full of misconceptions. And so they have a truth. I nearly drowned, my uncle drowned, something like that. And so people can die in water. Well, that's a truth, right? But there are a bunch of misconceptions around it. And so one of the important things for adults is to be able to get some exposure to things that challenge those misconceptions so that they start to think, oh, is that true? Is that true? And they start to question the stuff that they've carried forward to see if it's legit or not. And as they find out where things aren't legit, then they begin to say, oh, okay, well, if that's not true, what is true? And then we get to move on into the next space. And you did that with, I mean, when you started with us, we had, I think there were 3 swimmers in your group, right? All of whom swam decently well, one of whom had been a triathlon guy for years who had suddenly become scared of the water, right?
Yes.
And so I think he just finally realized he wasn't invincible. He was getting older and thought, oh my gosh, if I'm not invincible, what happens if I'm in deep water? Because I really don't know what to do, right?
Sure.
I haven't needed it until now. I need it now. What do I do with that? And that whole experience with people who we usually think of as, oh, these are swimmers. There's no reason for them to be scared. Suddenly they're scared is a fascinating kind of a thing that if you've been swimming all your life and you just think everybody swims, or once you know it, you got it, and you find out, wow, you don't. It's really a challenge to think about, okay, how do I step back, or what's the piece that never got taught that I got to figure out how to teach for them to understand to help them move forward, right? For me, it's one of the cool challenges of being a coach, is figuring out what piece is missing and how do I add that piece to help them move on to get back to where they were or to get where they want to go.
Sure, and I think your point is great about the need for comprehension of an adult. Like they want to know. That's why adults that pick up new skills have such a difficulty, is because you're right, kids are just doing.
Right.
You give a kid 2 drumsticks and he's gonna bang on it until he realizes that something sounds good. He's like, oh, suddenly there's a rhythm here, and you figure it out. And creating those neural synapses of just what works, what doesn't. Your misconception, a great example, is thrashing in the water.
Yep.
A lot of people think if I move harder and faster, it's going to keep me afloat. Big thing I talk about with my kids a lot is be water. I mean, I know it sounds, sounds very Bruce Lee, but water moves gently. It moves in waveforms. Yes, in storms it crashes and such, but it's still rhythmic even then, right? And so aimless thrashing in deep water, when I was doing adult lessons, I went over it with actually a couple swimmers who were a little bit more comfortable so they could get themselves back up. Yep. But I said, I want you to actively try to thrash around and see what happens. Yeah. And even if you're a great floater, you won't be floating because you're creating all those pockets and things like that, so on and so forth. Yeah. Another example is just going back of the example of the fragility of life. I think it takes one time to realize that even if I was a great swimmer, great drivers get in one, F1 for example, great drivers get in one major accident, and sometimes getting behind the wheel of a 200-mile-per-hour vehicle doesn't feel as good the next time you do it, right?
Yeah.
And skydivers and hang gliders and so on and so forth. Yeah. It takes one freak accident to really change how you feel about what you're doing, and so that's why we go about preventing that, or exactly mitigating some of those feelings that they might already have.
Or moving really, really slow and not pushing people who have come out of that place. Absolutely.
Right.
That's exactly right.
Rewinding a little bit, talking about getting people to learn swimming, you talked about triathletes. What's your experience, going about getting pushed with former athletes that have never swum before, picking up swimming, triathletes or other? How do they, we talk about getting pushed, and in that sense, right, pushing is probably the wrong answer because they're just going to grind their way through the water, and it's not very pretty, admittedly.
So my experience we've had 3 of my very favorite. So first, those athletes are sinkers. They're not floaters, right?
100%.
So whole different ball game from standard process, and I've got there are 3 guys who just come to mind every single time. Actually, there are 4 people, but 3 of them are guys. One was a college basketball player who won all kinds of awards. One was a college discus thrower who was just, he was just huge, just massive,
all
guy.
Mass, for sure.
I come back to the other guy, and then the lady was a cheer coach, and she was this little teeny ball of muscle, right? I mean, just muscle, and for all of them, they were used to going, used to driving, used to pushing, and they had. One of the hard things for sinkers, right, is that most of them, especially the athletic ones, are used to succeeding. I mean, they're used to driving, they're used to succeeding, going from there. And most of them, by the time they come to me, they have tried multiple lessons, and they've seen all these people float around them, and they haven't been able to float, and they felt like failures multiple times. And it's like,
Sure.
What the heck? There's something wrong with me in this space. And they don't have other people in the class sinking with them, which is a sad thing. So it's fun to get them together with other sinkers and say, see, this is just physics. Now let's talk about how to move you from there. But the first thing that I really struggle with is getting them to drop into the water and to just be calm and to get used to sinking and to sink calmly. To your point, be the water. I love that. I think that's cool. It's stolen. Consider it stolen.
Sure.
But we just get them to sink and to get comfortable. It's like, I'm not moving, I'm not swimming. It's like, it comes. You got to feel this piece. You got to see you sink slower. You got to see you don't drop like a rock like you say you do or think you do. Once we get this piece in place and now we know where you are, now let's use those skills you've got to help you propel and move, and then we'll get you to the top and go from there. So it's, especially the ones who are really, really driven, the hard thing is to get them to stop driving, because the driving, they're just not driving towards the thing that's going to get them there in most cases.
Sure.
In most cases.
And this can be literal or proverbial. With my competitive athletes, what I talk about is, if you want to hear a rattle in the engine, you've got to slow it down. So if you're driving too fast, the noise of the engine is going to drown out a loose bolt.
I love that. Yeah.
The moment you slow it down, you're going to hear that bolt clanking all over the engine, all over the compartment, right? And so it can be used in a proverbial sense that if you're just going all gas, no brakes, you're never going to see what's wrong with what you've been doing. And then it just leads to a futile cycle. Another example is writing an essay, right? We write so many things. We're used to our own participles of speech and just our patterns and syntax, right? And when we write something, we might read it and be like, oh yeah, it's good. I've read, reading books, things like that.
I never say that,
but if you read it out loud, you might find and read it slowly, you might find some of your mistakes instead of reading it as though it's just a book that you're skimming, because you're not going to recognize your own mistakes. Yeah. Because in our own minds, we're perfect, right? And so naturally we're not going to attribute some of the mistakes. But I think a great topic to finish up with today's video would be, and this is pretty overarching, so we might not cover everything, but what does swimming mean to you? What is the value of swimming? What does it bring to your life? What do you feel like it brings to other people's lives?
So swimming for me is all about comfort in the water, and it stops there. You can go fast if you want to, and it can be fun, but to me, the swimming itself is about being comfortable. And comfortable in deep water is the ultimate stage of that. The value, so for old folks like me, okay, who have ankles and knees and hips and things like that don't behave like they used to, swimming comes in real handy for that, because I get to keep moving and I get to keep functioning and be healthy, and that's true for everybody there. There's some wonderful social situations that you get to play with that, if you're for my scared people who go to pool parties and hang on to the side of the pool because they're scared to get out, there's a lot of that social interaction that they miss, and they don't feel a part of the folks who are there because they're hanging on and they see those other people who are not, and they know there's something different, and they feel like that's a big deal. So there's some social stuff that misses out with that. There's some family things. There are people whose families go to beaches and they sit the whole time on the beach and they'd love to go play with grandkids or whoever.
Sure.
So there are things like that. And there's some safety things, although for the people who argue you can do fine and never swim in your entire life, I can't argue with that. You can stay on land and be fine with that. But there's some wonderfulness that happens in the water that you can't. It doesn't happen in air.
No.
It happens in water, and there's some wonderful stuff out there. I think there's some wonderful value to, for in the competitive world, for the discipline that goes into that. It takes a lot of time and energy into
Sure.
that, for the focus into your technique and the awareness of yourself that comes with that. I think that's neat. I think that's true for our beginners too. We started there's an underwater torpedo league, which is for guys who are way past any of us from a long breath point of view. But think of it as kind of football underwater, right? When you can tackle each other and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, this is so fun. We got to figure out a way to make this happen. And it's not really conducive for beginners,
Sure.
right? It's a little carried away. So we've made it into this underwater team golf tournament. In fact, you should come play with us
Right,
sometime.
yeah, I'll have to.
So the goal is to see how fast you can throw this torpedo through the holes, and you get two of you in it. So, you know, you throw it and the next one's down there ready to make the next throw, but you got to get to them quickly so that if their throw misses, you know, you can pick it back up and get it through. And your goal is to see how fast you can get through however many holes we have laid out during the day. And it's really cool because it gives you, the reason I like it is because it requires an awareness about yourself, some proprioceptive pieces as well.
Absolutely.
That it builds it. It makes it fun. It's a new awareness of you in a new space, which broadens who you are. And I think that's I find people love it. So for me, the coolest thing about the swim is the comfort and the fun factor. I mean, those two are just the biggest, hands down. How about you? What does that change for you? How's that different?
Just got a few notes, and I think the proprioceptive thing is a big thing. I wasn't quite as coordinated pre-swimming, actually. I didn't have great balance and didn't have great awareness in space. Tried baseball, soccer, you know. Didn't love it quite as much, and there was something about swimming that I picked up, and evidently it actually made me a more coordinated athlete out of the water. I understood on a basketball court where I was in space or on a football field, on top of just becoming a better athlete, I was in better shape. I could run faster, jump higher, so on and so forth. But for me, swimming it's interesting. So it's one of the few times that you can reject the laws of physics, right? I mean, the laws of physics in water, yes, are still there, but
you get to toss the laws that are on the land.
Right. So, I mean, you do not have to walk on 2 feet. Frankly, it's not very easy, you know, and you know, you can play mermaids, you can go diving for quarters, you can go do all these things that you just can't do on land. And there's something unique about that. It's you know, from a competitive standpoint, it's one of the few sports that requires you to be horizontal.
Right.
One of the only, and on top of that, already being unique as it is, it's in water.
Yeah. So we spend a whole lot of time talking about the difference between air and water. You know, in the air, everything sinks. In the water, no. How funny. How it doesn't sink. Look at that. You come back up. What happened with that? You know, if you throw your hand around in air like this, it doesn't do anything at all. If you throw your hand around like that in water, it spins you back and forth. It's a completely different environment. It's a different space with its own set of rules, and it is the difference in those two that brings a lot of fear for people coming into the water. A lot of the misconceptions are thinking that the rules are going to be exactly the same as air. My favorite one is how forgiving the water is. If you go to trip on land, it takes you that long to hit your face and you're done. You know, if you trip on water, you know, if you've got any breath at all, you probably never get to the bottom. And if you're a good sinker, it'll take you, and you blow all your air out, it's still going to take you, for me, it takes 12 to 15 minutes, right? Seconds, rather, to get there. And there's all this time to move, and there's all this forgiveness that if you're just on the land, you never appreciate it.
Right,
So.
and I think my other half of it is really that it's quietly loud. So swimming, the only noise is the sound in your head, right? So as a recreational post-competitive swimmer that I am, I mean, it's the only time that you get to be with your thoughts. We're just inundated by phones and conversations and work and assignments and things that we have to do in our day-to-day lives, and it's the only time I can just be quiet, that I'm awake.
Very meditative.
It's very meditative.
If you allow it to be, yeah.
I think swimming is writing in cursive. It's speaking in French. Everything is connected. Everything is put together. It's smooth. It's rhythmic. It's natural. And so for me, where it does come more naturally, it's just a time to be introspective and also perhaps blow off a little bit of steam. I mean, it's just a very natural way for me to spend a little bit of energy in what feels like a meaningful way at that time.
To burn a little bit of energy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So with all those things put together, it's a time that you can step back from reality, like I said, with the physics example and just with the reality of our day-to-day lives. It's one of the few times you can really step back away from that and not have somebody in your ear, or just have things that are burdensome, that you might be dealing with, right? So I tell my kids that once they walk in the pool, there's nothing they can change about their lives outside the four walls. And so a lot of our talk about mental health is surrounded around that. And so I think it definitely has helped my mental health throughout the years. It's in a lot of good ways. I think performing well was part of that, but later on in life, it's just being back in the water and getting a chance to do what I've loved for so many years. But I think with that, I think it'll be time to close it up. But Perry, I've loved this conversation.
It's always fun. It's always fun.
Yeah, every time, it's always fruitful. There's always a new topic to talk about, and love bouncing ideas off. You guys, we loved doing this for you guys, but if you guys enjoyed what we did for you today, please make sure to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, do what you do, and show us a little love on YouTube and wherever else you're coming from. And we'll hope to bring more content just like this or other content. Let us know what you like, and let us know where you're watching this from too. Looking forward to seeing you guys next time.
Thanks for watching today's video. If you liked it, be sure to subscribe, share, ring the bell, comment with any questions. If you're in the DFW area and you'd like more information on swim lessons or swim team, be sure to visit www.sigmaswim.org.